I have written 2 courses for CHESSABLE. One of them, the latest, is about the Smyslov Ruy-Lopez. It is here after knight c6, bishop b5, g6. So, well, it is a very interesting opening. So basically, when we see that our opponents play the Ruy-Lopez, we think, okay, we will have to learn a lot of theory, it will be some very long game, and quite passive, strategical game. But with this g6 move, we actually get very interesting positions, and there is no need to learn everything move by move. You can simply learn a few ideas, and I hope that you will like it. So it is called the Smyslov Ruy-Lopez because Vasily Smyslov was the one who popularized it the most. And here is a game he played versus very young Garry Kasparov. And it is not a surprise that Garry went for the most aggressive line, which was considered at the time d4. So, well, Black's idea was, of course, simple: to develop the bishop, bishop g7, d6, continue the development with knight e7 or knight f6, and then short castle. So d4 is meant to destabilize the center. So d4, e takes, knight d4, and bishop g7.
What is the alternative to d4?
Yeah, we will see quite a few games here. The main lines are c3 and short castle.
Oh yeah, okay.
So short castle is kind of a slower move, and c3 is meant that after d4 it takes, white wants to recapture back with the c-pawn. Actually, yesterday I played with black pieces, and I played exactly this system. I was hoping to show a nice winning game, but instead we'll be seeing a nice drawn game. But all right. So d4, e takes, knight d4, bishop g7. White has to solve the problem of the knight on d4. Knight takes c6 usually isn't a good idea because it helps black to bring one more pawn to the center, just b takes c6. And when the bishop goes, we continue the development with knight f6. And there is actually a very nice trick here that after e5, black can just play knight e4. And after queen e2, there is no need to defend the knight. Black can simply castle. And the point is that after queen takes e4, there is this nice tactics d5. And e takes runs into rook to e8, and the queen is trapped, while otherwise we just win the piece back. So here Garry played bishop to e3, knight to f6, continuing the development, knight to c3, and now short castle. Short castle is the main move, and interestingly enough, this position was first played by Steinitz. So it was, I think the first game was in 1887 or something like that. But this is still a theoretical position played even these days. So the correct move here is quite a surprising one. It's knight to e7. The idea is to prepare c6, and it actually has a little trap, like a strategical trap here, the point being that e5 doesn't really work. Let's see if you can find why. It's not a tactical solution, rather a strategical one. Well, of course, one which also involves a bit of calculation. So let's see. How do you continue after e5? Yes, knight to d5. And now it's a sort of a double attack because the pawn on e5 is hanging, and also the bishop on e3. And actually white here is quite in some trouble. For example, knight takes d5, knight takes d5. And, well, knight f3 isn't really a move you want to make because we just take, and it is simply a disaster here. And other than that, there are no good solutions. For example, queen d2, let's say, then the pawn on e5 is hanging. So, yeah, not a pleasant choice for white. And that's why this knight e7 is an interesting move. But back then, I guess it was still not discovered, and Smyslov played rook to e8, simply attacking the pawn on e4. And actually the most natural move, which is f3, is already imprecise. Rook to e1 was better, somehow indirectly protecting the pawn on e4, because now taking would run into knight c6, and b takes bishop c6. So the queen is pinned. But okay, he played f3, and now Smyslov continued with knight to e5, basically saying that this bishop on b5 is not a great piece here, and it will run into trouble. White continued with h3, preparing f4, so that there is no knight g4, and now a6, bishop to e2, and here d6 would have been better, but well, d5 looks like a very logical move to finish the development, open up this bishop, and make breakthrough in the center. The simplifications don't work well for white here, because this bishop on e3 is a tactical weakness. It is not protected by anything. So now knight takes d5, take, and black has a very comfortable position. For example, bishop f2, then knight to c6. And actually here we see that this bishop on g7 is the piece that we count on most in this opening. It's sort of like in the King's Indian, only that this bishop has better prospects here, that it's not closed by its own pawn on e5. So this bishop on g7 is the piece we rely on the most in this opening. After d5, Kasparov played f4. Now knight to c4, bishop takes, d takes. The pawn is hanging, so queen to f3. And now black continued with c5. The knight has to go back, and there was a very nice trick here, one which Smyslov somehow missed, or perhaps he didn't want to simplify the position, but there was this knight takes e4. The point being that after knight takes, queen to e7, and when knight g3, there is this nice move, bishop to f5. And now, well, one piece will gonna fall. Bishop takes c5, we take on e4, and if knight takes f5, just g takes f5, and again we win back a piece. And also notice that this bishop is really a monster here. But instead, Smyslov decided to continue the development slowly with bishop to d7, e5 followed, bishop to c6, queen f2, and knight to d7. And it's a very interesting moment here, because we see basically white wanted to play against this bishop. So this is the main strategical problem here, that it is closed. And white can capture a pawn here on c5, but they will give up one more bishop. And it's quite funny how even Garry Kasparov, being very young at the moment, decided to take the pawn, and I noticed many young players like to grab the pawns. But actually the best move was simply to improve the position with rook a to d1. And it is not easy for black to produce here anything. Like if b6, protecting the pawn, then knight d5, and the second knight comes to e4, and the bishop on g7 once again struggles a lot. But Kasparov took the pawn, and now black got very good counterplay. Knight takes, queen takes, rook c8. Well, first the queen has to move, because otherwise bishop takes g2 is unpleasant. So, okay, he introduced rook d1 as an intermediate, queen h4, and queen to e3. And now, in order to solve the problem of the dark squared bishop, black continued with g5, undermining white's very nice pawn construction in the center. Yeah, so Kasparov played knight to d5. Now g takes f4, rook takes f4, and queen to g5. And we see that a lot of things are hanging here for white. So first of all, the pawn on e5 is hanging. Then the knight from d5 cannot really move because of the threat of mate on g2. The queen on e3 is pinned. So white doesn't have a lot of pleasant choices. Knight to f6 check followed. King h8. White has to defend against the threat of mate. Queen f2. And now black simply took on e5, getting back the sacrificed pawn. Here, white could have still continued the fight with knight to g3, somehow covering this g file. And after bishop f6, rook f6, rook g8, there is actually rook takes f7, and queen takes g3 doesn't work here because of queen f6 check. Now after rook g7, there is rook f8 mate. So actually here, black would have probably to go to this endgame, where, okay, white could still survive, even though this pawn on g2 is, of course, very weak. But instead, Gary played knight d4, which was a blunder because of bishop takes f6, rook takes, and bishop takes g2. And we see that the poor queen on f2 was doing too many jobs protecting on g2 and on f6. Now it's basically game over. King h2, rook e3, queen takes g2, queen f6, extra exchange, queen b7, and queen f4, and this game was over. Okay, so...
in the opening there where white played bishop e3,
yes?
could you have played c3 to try and win up the dark bishop?
Here.
Yeah, that move.
Yeah, that is a move. Interesting. Well, knight to f6 would be the most logical continuation. The problem of c3, yeah, you are limiting the bishop, but on the other hand, you are taking away a very important square for your own knight. So basically, the c3 square was better for the knight, and now somehow if you play knight d2, then the bishop on c1 is closing, and you won't be able to develop the pieces in a harmonious way. That's, I guess, the main reason why white tried to play bishop e3 and then knight to c3.
So c3 not played then?
No, actually not. Well, yeah, jumping back to the conclusions. Well, so basically that rook e8 move was a nice alternative. Where was it? To the main move, knight to e7 here. So it's a move to consider. Another one is that when we feel that the game is going not our way, we can try to change the character of it, like Smyslov did with sacrificing the pawn on c5. He felt that he was worse strategically, so he tried to attract his opponent to a different type of position. What else? Well, of course, playing against these bishops, you saw that the bishop on g7 got limited in this game by white's playing very well f4 and e5. And yeah, what I would like to highlight is basically the importance of this dark squared bishop in the Smyslov-Ruy-Lopez, and how both sides are trying to build their play around it. All right, let's move on to the next game. They will get more interesting. Okay, one was here, I liked it particularly match. It was played between two very good women players, Pogonina and Kolemova, in the very strong Russian championship. So it was e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, g6. Here white chose a slower plan with short castle. And in this game it's very interesting because white plays very logically and gets worse. And this is what I like the most about this opening. So bishop to g7, c3, and now black starts with a6. And it's quite interesting. White has, of course, all the free moves. Bishop takes c6 is a more modern option. Then we take back with the t-pawn. There is also bishop c4, and the move played in the game bishop a4. After bishop c4, it's a funny moment because here black can even play f5. It looks very strange, and I know it's like against all the chess principles, but tactically it works fine here because, well, e takes f5 runs into d5, so it's not good. And the move d4 runs into f takes e4. And, well, white has to do something about this knight. Perhaps knight takes e5 is the most logical move, but then black can play d5, and then he's in time to finish the development very fast with knight e7 and short castle. So, yeah, bishop c4. I'm waiting, you know, every game I play, I'm waiting for somebody to go with the bishop on c4. Unfortunately, no one does. It seems that everyone knows that it should go on a4, but the hopes dies last. Well, here we continue with, okay, knight e7. We can also start with d6. This is also another thing which I like about the opening, is that it basically leads to the same positions no matter if you choose one move order or the other. So white plays d4, yeah, very logically, to take the control in the center. We take and play b5. And here white has a choice, bishop b3 or bishop c2. Both moves are possible. The idea will be that this knight from c6 will go either to a5 or to b4, depending on where this bishop will retreat. So basically, if bishop b3, then we will later have knight a5, and if bishop c2, we will have knight b4 in order to open up the path for this bishop to attack the e4 pawn. Here, Pogonina played bishop b3, very logical, short castle. Okay, moves like d5 cannot really be good, because after knight a5, we either take the bishop or the knight gets very nicely to c4, and the pawn on b2 will become very weak. So after castle, what is the most logical move? To continue the development now with knight to c3. Knight to a5 now, the bishop goes to c2, and d6. And it is actually almost the position I had yesterday also in the game. h3, c5. But my opponent played surprisingly to me better than Pogonina. He didn't play bishop to g5. And it's actually very interesting that here for white to develop the bishop from c1 is already not the best decision. So it doesn't matter, bishop f4 or bishop g5, we will see why it's not so good. My opponent played, I think, rook to e1 here. Yeah, so basically the idea is to wait, not to develop the bishop from c1, so that after knight c4, white would have b3. Because if the bishop would be gone after b3, the knight can go to a3. And then, yeah, somehow black's idea is to get one bishop or another. So in the game bishop g5 was played. Why it's not good? It's because of h6. And now the bishop has to go either on f4 or on h4. Bishop h4 is the wrong direction because now it won't be able to protect the d4 pawn. And we can start attacking it by knight a to c6. And if white plays something like d5, we can play just knight d4 with a very good play for black here. When white will take, we can take back with the bishop. And basically we have this signature dark squared bishop here, which makes the position to be great. Actually, there was played a very nice game in this tournament. Alexeyenko won with black in a different move order, but they got to the same positions as we analyze here. He played against the Indian grandmaster. All right, so in the game, Pogonina played bishop to f4, and now it is time to take on d4 and play bishop b7, basically completing the development and starting to put some pressure on the e4 pawn. Rook to b1, white wants to prepare b3 and not to be hanging on this long diagonal. We continue with rook c8, all very logical moves. And now perhaps it was better to play something like rook to e1, but Pogonina played knight d to e2, which also looks completely normal, no? Attacking the pawn on d6, opening up this d-file for the queen. But after d5, the position suddenly got worse for white. The main point is that white cannot close our bishop with e5 because this pawn won't be protected. Knight c4 was played in the game, but knight a to c6 would be even better, and this pawn is simply falling. And you might wonder why not take on d5. But basically all these positions which look quite symmetrical are actually very unpleasant for white to play because there is a much better bishop here. And the pawn on b2, on a2, they will be weak. For example, take, 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 take. Now the bishop on c2 is hanging, the pawn on a2 is hanging. Life is difficult for white here. There's already a significant advantage. So yeah, it looks nice now to get an advantage with black in the Ruy Lopez so easily, apparently, without doing too much. And that's why it's not so easy for white. You know, there are different move orders. Black can start with g6 on third move, or d6, or first a6 and then g6. So basically white gets confused a lot. And I find that it's a very big pleasure to play it with black. All right, so basically after e5, the game continued with knight to c4, rook to e1, and here is the pawn. Just a healthy central extra pawn. Knight d4, knight c4 back. Well, here the technique wasn't ideal, so there were still chances for white, but well, it is not what we want to focus on. The advantage is here, so let's assume that we would all convert it. And let's move on to another game to see as many structures as possible from this opening. Maybe some of you will get inspired to play it even today. Let's move on. So, well, here is an interesting game. One played in the Gibraltar. Unfortunately, it is not happening next year, but let's hope it will get back at some point. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I was talking to Stuart Conquest. He doesn't think it will ever come back.
My hope never dies. It was too nice of a tournament, and players like Caruana played. And here he decided to go for this opening. Again, it's a very sharp one, and when we see players like Caruana, Mamediarov playing it, then it's a very good sign that the opening is healthy. So c3 was played, again like in the previous game, a6, bishop a4, and d6. White played d4. And now another way of solving all these issues in the center is to play bishop to d7. It might look like a passive move, but we actually don't want to trade queens here over the d-file. And we get ready that after d5, we can play knight c to e7. And now we are heading to structures which remind a lot about the King's Indian. But you see, compared to the King's Indian, white has to use a few tempes in order to finish the development in a harmonious way with c4 and then knight to c3. And in the same time, we haven't developed this knight from g8, and we maybe won't develop it before playing f5 at all. So the game continued with bishop d7, queen d7, c4. And now we would love to play f5, but we have to take care of these two squares first. So h6, preventing knight g5. And only after knight c3, black continued with f5. So we have this pawn chain. If you are familiar with it, then you know that the best way to attack a pawn chain is attacking its base. And the bases are e4 and c4. And it is quite funny that in this game, Caruana attacked this pawn chain from all the sides. But, okay, we'll see it.
Sorry, in the King's Indian, usually if black loses his white squared bishop, it's to white's advantage, isn't it? Is it not the same here?
Well, it depends. Losing it for what, you know?
White pawns are on white squares, and black pawns are mainly on black squares.
Yeah.
In the King's Indian, if you're going to attack on the King's side, you need a white square bishop usually. But is it not the same in this?
No, here it is a little bit different because you will see white doesn't have time to stabilize these very nice pawns he has. We will attack it from all the sides. And actually, the fact that this bishop is gone allows us to do it. So there are downsides and advantages, of course. Because you know, sometimes black in King's Indian simply plays bishop g4 and bishop takes f3, giving up the bishop, the light squared bishop, but then trying to get better squares for the knights. For example, one knight goes to c5, another one goes to h5 or something like that. So I wouldn't say that it's a rule that when black doesn't have the light squared bishop in a King's Indian structure, it is to white's advantage. Yeah. Okay, we'll see it also in this game, like knight to e1, knight to f6, f3. So white tries to play against our dark squared bishop. So to say that, to highlight that it is a bad piece, but it's not a bad piece. It's like a sleeping dragon here. So short castle, knight to d3, and black placed g5. Well, rook f7 is the move which I recommend in the course, but it's basically a very similar idea. So g5, the point is that black wants to prepare the usual King's Indian attack with f4, h5, and g4. And now you see it's really unclear. Would it help to white to have a bishop on e2 and, let's say, for black to have the bishop on d7 or not? They most probably would get traded anyway after a move like g4, f takes, and so on. So here, the Indian Grandmaster decided to take on f5. Well, it's a move I don't particularly like because it takes the pressure off in the center. But, well, it's understandable because, well, he had almost 300 points less than Fabiano, and perhaps he was happy with keeping the position as simple as possible. Queen takes f5. Well, now this is an odd-looking move because it looked more natural to take with the knight. But why not taking with the knight is because we want to keep as much pressure on the d5 pawn as possible. We will see that Caruana intended to continue fighting against the pawn chain with c6 and then even b5. So knight to f2, trying to bring a knight to e4, and now b5. Well, of course, taking on b5 is possible, but then the pawn on d5 is falling, and black will have a really nice center. So instead, white tried to keep the pawn chain with queen to e2, but Fabi played here c6, and we see that actually the whole white's central pawn chain will be gone. Knight f to e4 was played, and now a little tactical sequence followed. Knight takes e4, knight takes. Well, taking with the pawn would result in losing a pawn, After all the exchanges on f1, the pawn on c4 is hanging. So white took with the knight, b takes c4, knight takes d6, the queen went to g6, knight is hanging, so knight takes c4, c takes, knight takes e5, and now black continued with queen to e6. And we see that at the price of a pawn, black has opened up the sleeping monster on g7, and also white hasn't finished the development. So here black basically achieved what he wanted. The game continued with rook e1. Still, it's of course black doesn't have an advantage, but it's just a complicated positions where both sides have to be quite precise, and the better player usually has to win. Knight to f5. There is knight d3. There is knight g4. Knight d3 is perfectly good move. Queen b6 check. King h1, and rook a to e8. And you see, we are basically playing with an extra piece because the rook on a1 is not participating in the game. Now, taking on e8 would be a mistake precisely because of that. After king f7, rook e1, queen d4, we are winning because, well, these two pieces are not coming into the game too soon. So queen f1 was played, a good move. Take on e1. Taking with the queen was possible, but white went a bit imprecise and took with the knight. And now queen to g6. Actually, this move is preparing some mating nets because the bishop wants to come on d4, and then there will be knight g3 threats, followed by queen to h5. So queen d3 was played, bishop d4. Now it wouldn't be nice to receive such a mate after knight g3, so white had to play g4. But now we see that a lot of squares here become really loose. Rook to e8, nice intermediate move, attacking the knight on e1. And now the only move was queen to d1, which looks not so tempting, placing all the pieces on the last rank. But it was necessary, and somehow white was holding up here. But instead, he chose to move bishop to e3, which looks like a nice tactical way of solving the problem, but it actually just leads to a lost endgame. So rook takes e3 followed, queen f5, take, and bishop takes b2. And now we have equal material, but also we have a fantastic bishop, a passed pawn, more active rook. What can we wish for more? So rook to d1, bishop c3, and black actually managed to convert this game very nicely, simply going to a rook endgame here, but after rook a5, black's king is coming, and then 2 extra pawns will be more than enough. So okay, in these closed positions with a closed center, I would say that it is rather important that we attack the pawn chain from the base, yes, either with f5 or with c6. Well, also, if we want to attack our opponent's king, it's possible to go on like in the King's Indian with closing up a bit the position with f4 and then preparing g4. So, yeah, I guess that will be it about this game, and we'll move to another one. Let's save here. Yeah, so this is one of my favorite games in the opening. It was played during the candidates tournament in Berlin in the first game. And once again, it was the sign I needed that this opening is valid if it was played at this level. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, g6. So up to now, we saw the moves d4 in the first game. We saw short castle. And now it's time for c3. After all of them, we continue in similar way, a6. Okay, after d4 we grab the pawn, but so we know about the move bishop a4. We saw quite some games in it. We know about bishop c4. Actually, in this position, f5 works as well. It's not even a novelty, but just trust me. So now let's see bishop takes c6. Well, here b takes c6 isn't great because somehow we will then struggle to open up this bishop. So why not open it just in one go with d takes c6? White continued with d4, e takes, c takes. And now we get this kind of structure which, okay, if there would be to make an analogy, it would look a lot to me like Rossolimo, like e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, g6. Yeah, because white doesn't have a light squared bishop and black took on c6. Only that in there, white rarely goes for d4 and basically tries to play with d3, knight c3, and so on. So I would say that this is a convenient version. The point for white here is that they want to create some threats very quickly, because strategically it's not a great position. Black simply wants to play bishop g7, knight e7, castle, and then start attacking these pawns in the center. So basically the bishop is stuck on c1 because if it goes away it will be c5 and the pawn on b2 will be weak. And in the same time there are threats of bishop g4, pinning this knight and increasing the pressure on d4. And that's exactly how black started here, by playing bishop g4 and threatening to take on f3 and then on d4. And now the only solution white has to put some problems is with queen b3, going away from the pin and attacking on b7. Black took on f3, white must take back with the pawn, and now bishop to g7. We don't want to take on d4 too soon, because we want to be able to meet queen takes b7 with short castle. So white has a choice here. If taking on b7, then black continues with knight to e7, because the pawn on d4 is attacked twice. We mustn't hurry to take it. We can do it anytime later. So instead, we continue our development. The best move was bishop e3, the one played in the game. Now knight to e7. Once again, as a rule, we want to be able to play short castle after queen b7. This is how I remembered my lines here. Now white continued with knight c3, and as we are ready to castle, we can take now on d4. And here, surprisingly, Karakin went for a bad move, which is take back on d4. The engine's choice is to castle long, and it's also quite logical to the human eye. And after c5 to take on b7, short castle. And this position is actually balanced. Of course, engines find a way to trade everything and show 0.00, but for a human being it's not so obvious. For example, let's say there is a move like knight e2, and it looks like black is losing a pawn, but we can actually continue with queen d7 and prepare something like queen e6, rook comes to b8, and we will have our own threats against white's king. Anyway, it is the best try to go for a long castle. Bishop takes d4 isn't good because of what happened in the game. Queen takes d4, queen takes b7, and simply short castle. Now we connected the rooks. The main threat is to play rook b8 and take on b2, so white really has to do something about it. Karakin went on to take the pawn on c7, and there was actually a really nice way for black to continue. There was the move knight to d5. A tactical shot which I'm not sure if Mamedjarov missed. Perhaps he saw it, but he preferred the move he played in the game. But after knight d5, white would be in big trouble because, okay, first of all, queen takes c6 doesn't work because of knight b4 and all kind of forks are coming. So there is e takes d5 and knight takes d5. E takes d5, the king will be in a sort of a mating net. So queen to d3. And now rook e8 is a very serious threat, and after knight e4 there will always be either f5 or c takes d5. For example, here if queen f4, rook e8, knight e4, and take on d5, the king is still stuck in the center and we get back our knight. So I guess what he didn't like was knight takes d5, c takes d5, and queen to c3. And perhaps he thought that this endgame would be, let's say, held by Karakin. Who knows? He chose a different move, but with a similar idea, rook a to b8, still sacrificing this knight on e7, but wanting to get the pawn on b2. So if queen takes c7, rook b2, short castle, after queen c3, we would have the exact position as in the game. They started with short castle, rook b2, queen e7, and queen takes c3. And now, once again, looking at this position, it is clear that black is better, right? Because, well, this pawn structure on the king side is spoiled for white. And also, it's basically like playing with an extra pawn, because this c pawn has no opponent on the c file. And for white, on the other hand, to create a passed pawn, it would take huge effort on the king side. So let's see how, okay, Karakin was famous for being able to defend bad positions, but here he did not manage to. So king to g2 was played. Now rook c2, preventing those ideas with rook c1 and rook takes c6. Now rook to d1, take on a2, rook to c1, rook c2, take, and rook a1. So I guess Karakin was counting on the fact that he will win back one of the pawns and the position will liquidate to a very drawish, I wouldn't call it an endgame because they still have the queens on the board, but let's say to a drawish middle game. Queen c4, queen b7, and now queen to b5. A very nice practical try for black. Because, well, if this pawn would be on g3, then it's clear that there would be no chances for black to win the game. But because this king is somehow weak, white has to be careful. So, queen takes a6 followed, queen to g5 check, king f1, queen f6. This is the best square for the queen because it attacks the pawn on f3, it holds our own pawn on c6, and also keeps an eye on the rook on a1. King g2, and now it's time to activate the rook from f8. Rook to b8, threatening on playing rook to b3. It's rather strange that Karakin here didn't do anything about this threat. He simply continued with rook a5. Instead, a move like...
The black plays to draw or to win?
Sorry?
The black plays to draw or to win?
How do you think?
To draw, no?
No, I think black wants to win.
No, it's not check.
No, well, as I was saying here, black is better basically because of this pawn on c6, which is like an extra pawn, as white cannot create a passed pawn on the other side of the board. So that's why we play for a win here. But, well, if you want to make a draw, it's not a big problem. You can play for a draw here as well. So rook b8, rook a5 was played, rook b3. Okay, the pawn on f3 is hanging, and the only way of defending it is with either queen e2, which is very passive, or with queen c8. Interestingly enough, queen e2 was best, just to go in passive defense. After queen c8, king g7, queen g4. Black has a way to force white to go into a queen endgame. And now in the queen endgame, it is still drawn, but it becomes much more difficult to make this draw. So once again, there is this passed pawn, and white's idea will be to somehow try to combine stopping the b pawn and creating some perpetual check threats. For that to happen, white will need to open up somehow black's king, which is still a long way to go. So white started with queen d7, queen g5 check, king f1, queen e5. Of course, if giving up the b pawn, then only for the h2 one, because we need to have another passer. So we cannot afford of losing the b5 pawn without getting the h1. White played h4. Now b4, the pawn runs towards queening. Queen b7, queen c3. White played e5. And now you already probably notice that white is very close to getting to that positions where they can make the perpetual with something like queen e7, queen f6, and then our king is not so great here on g7. We continue with b3, king to g2. White must protect first, of course, the pawn on f3 before playing queen to e7, and now queen to c4. The best square for the queen now will be on e6, because it will attack e5, and in the same time it will support our own b3 pawn. So queen b6, h6 first here to make an extra square for the king, king g3, queen d5, white must play f4, king h7, and here my guess is that the players just wanted to reach move 40, and they made a few shuffling moves, f3, and now queen c3. Queen f8 followed, queen to c4, queen b8, shuffling here and there, queen d5, queen b8, and now the moment of truth has come. Black played queen to d1. Okay, threatening at some point to play queen g1, and who knows what later. And here, actually, Karakin went wrong, because even if it's an unclear threat, this of queen g1, I mean, like, there is no follow-up, it was still better to prevent it and play something like queen b6. In the same time, going again for these ideas with queen f6. For example, king g2 would be already bad, because after queen c2 check, king g3, the white queen is not on the right square. So after b2, there is no queen f6 check. And if white continues with queen d8, we just queen, and there is no perpetual. So okay, there are already some problems here. White played queen b7, not exactly the right place, but still it's the position is drawn with correct play, of course. King h3, queen to e3, double attack. And now it's interesting that king to g3 already loses because of the move g5. And we are successful here in trying to open up white's king. So for example, take, queen e5, king f2, and b2. And now there will be no perpetuals, and slowly this pawn will become a queen. So in some cases, we can even bring on our king and bring it closer to the b pawn, because all the pawn endgames, of course, are easily won. So after queen e3, Karakin made the only move which still saves the game, king g2. Now the point is that after queen f4, white has the move e6, basically liquidating to a completely drawish endgame after queen f6, take on b3, take on e6, queen c3. Of course, we still have an extra pawn, but it is very difficult to convert it because, well, there is no passer, and many pawn endgames are already drawn here. So that's why taking wasn't good. Instead, they repeated the moves once, and after king g3, black played queen e1, and now somehow probably he forgot that the right way here was to go on h3. And instead he played king to g2, and actually there was a Zugzwang here, queen to e3. Now the point being, of course, that after king g3 there is g5, like in the previous variation. And the same happened after queen b4, g5. Take, take, queen e2, king g3. Now, actually it was Mamedyarov's turn to make the wrong call. b2 was the only winning move. It wasn't necessary to grab the pawn first. And now after e6 there is queen e5 check and take with the pawn. And actually the pawn on g5 will fall anyway. The king simply approaches and there will be no good way for white to defend it. In the game he took on e5, which looks very logical, but it wasn't good. Because white could have played f4, and now the pawn on g5 will be untouchable. Yeah, it's simply protected by the other pawn. So queen e3, king g4. And somehow, interestingly enough, there is no way for the pawn to promote. Queen e2, king g3, queen c2, queen d4 check. And now black's king cannot escape from all these checks. So f4, yeah, it was surprising that Karakin didn't play it. Instead, he went for king to f2. But now the position is lost again. Queen h2, king e3, queen g1, king f4, queen c1, king g4. Again, he didn't find the best way, queen e3. And here, once again, f4 was necessary, the only way to draw. It's interesting how many mistakes in one game at such a strong tournament, but, well, it happens apparently not only in our own game. All right, so king g3 was played, and now finally he took on g5, king f2 and queen d5. Well, now it's clear that this is winning because there cannot be any perpetual. We have this very nice pawn on b3, and it was a matter of time until white resigned. Black simply approached with the king, and at some point the checks are over. So here, if queen a8, then the king will come to b5, to b4, to c3, and then they will be over. So, okay, of course, a difficult game, but a very interesting one. Here we saw how to handle the position if white takes on c6. So once again, our strategy is based on the dark squared bishop and putting pressure on the pawn on d4. And I guess that this covers most of the structures. So, okay, here after a6, once again, we saw bishop a4, we saw bishop c6, bishop c4, I told you about this f5. So, yeah, more or less we have covered all the structures. Let me show you now one of my masterpieces from yesterday. You will be laughing, but please don't. Okay, so I was very happy preparing a good game for today's conference. At least I hoped so. c3, I played a6, hoping and praying for bishop c4, but never it happens. Bishop a4 was played, d6. Okay, so here I think we saw a game with h3, but okay, he chose a different move order, which is rook to e1. I put the engine here yesterday after the game, and I saw it says g5. And they say, like, really? What is this move? But it has some logic to it. Because the rook, I was thinking, what is the difference between rook e1 and h3, you know? Like, it's the same thing, we go to the same position. But there is a difference, because here after g5, the knight doesn't have the e1 square. So now after g4, we simply win the knight if white doesn't do anything. And if white plays h3, then we take advantage of the fact that we did not castle, and we can play h5, followed by g4. And apparently here the position is already -1. And it actually looks like it, because what is with all these pieces? And the king is already in trouble. And somehow after g5, the only way for white to continue is d4, which makes sense. But then after g4, white has to sacrifice a pawn. So we simply take on d4. And then, okay, white has to prove that there is any compensation to the pawn. So, okay, note taken. Next time, I will know about g5. This time, I simply wanted to head to the positions which we saw before. So I played knight e7, h3 castle, d4, b5. It reminds a lot about the game of Pogonina with Galamova, which we saw. Take, take, knight a5. I think it's exactly the same position here. Bishop c2, c5. Knight c3, bishop b7. And here, Pogonina played bishop g5. And then this whole sequence with h6, bishop f4, take on d4 followed. But my opponent here played rook to b1, also going away from this diagonal. Here I didn't estimate correctly the outcomes of taking in the center. So it was necessary to take, and keep this knight on a5. Why? We will see in a moment. So here rook c8 would be the best move. White still has a problem about developing this bishop. For example, bishop e3 runs into knight c4. And now knight takes b2 is a threat, knight a3 is a threat. This knight on c3 is basically the problem in white's position. So after rook c8, it is very hard for white to finish normally the development. Like bishop g5 is an empty move because we continue with rook to e8, and still we will have this knight c4 ideas all the time. Instead, I thought, why not play knight a to c6 first? Also put pressure on the pawn on d4. We already know that d5 isn't great because of knight d4, and our bishop is fantastic. But the point is that after bishop e3, we have no knight to go to c4. So that's why it was necessary to keep the knight on a5, because it was basically neutralizing this dark squared bishop white has.
Could you play the other knight to c6 instead?
Yes, it is possible, but somehow I didn't like that here after d5, this knight gets a little bit stuck. So let's say knight d4, and it will have a very long way to go back to the game. We would need some knight c4, knight b6, knight d7, knight e5. Feels like a bit long. At least it did feel so for me, but who knows? Maybe it's also a possible idea. Yeah, somehow it felt that after, let's say, d5, knight d4, this knight on e7 is better than if it would be on a5, no? Because maybe we can go for some f5 and also fight against this pawn on d5. That was why I didn't play the other knight. Okay, my opponent played bishop to e3. Now I took on d4, knight d4. And well, I need to go for that c4 square, so I played knight to e5. But it would be nicer to go already on c4, yeah, if the knight would be on a5. He continued with b3, rook to c8, queen d2, all logical. And now the position looks nice, but it's unclear how to continue. Because, for example, queen c7 runs into knight to e2. And white's idea is to play f4, make this knight go away. Then what do I have? What am I left with? For example, the problem of the move d5, and that's actually the reasoning why I did the move in the game, is that after f4, when the knight goes somewhere, knight c6, let's say, white will have e5. And they will achieve what they wanted to close up our bishop. That's why we can't allow it. So after queen d2, I played knight 5 to c6, which looks like a waste of time because this knight went all the way to all the squares. But it was mainly directed against the idea of f4. And now here, white cannot play f4 because after queen c7, one piece will most probably be gone here. So after knight c6, he took on c6, and I guess he expected me to take on c6 with a light piece, either with knight or bishop, but I took with the rook. That was my idea, so that the knight has to go. Going to d5 isn't good because I can just take, and after e takes d5, we just go back with the rook, and there are a lot of weaknesses here in white's position. So after rook c6, he went knight to e2, and now I was very happy. I played d5, said, okay, now I go to this structure, which is quite symmetrical, but I have better bishops. And he played bishop d4, which is already quite a big mistake. I think he missed something. Okay, I will just show it later. But the best move was knight to d4 instead of bishop d4. Force my rook go back, and then try to create some threats with bishop to g5. Well, it's still quite complicated, but at least white is by no means worse here. Because after bishop d4, white got pinned all the way. So you see, if the knight would go to d4, the queen on d2 would be protected by the bishop. But if the bishop goes, I can simply take on e4, which I did. And after bishop e4, rook d6, it is temporary piece sacrifice. Bishop takes b7. But after knight f5, well, it is important not to take on d4 immediately, of course, because then after queen e3, there are a lot of things hanging here, and okay, black cannot hope for an advantage. But if we introduce this knight f5 move, then the story is different. Rook to d1 was played. And now a question, how do you think? What is the best way to capture on d4? Yeah, that would be the most logical move, but it's not the best move. And here I spent a lot of time figuring this thing out. Well, the problem if taking with the knight, okay, let's assume we take back with the bishop, white can have a move just like king h1, let's say, okay, because, or bishop f3, there are two moves actually, because the threat is to take on f2, right, and then the rook on d1 will be hanging. So you either protect it by playing bishop f3, and then you're ready to capture on f2 with the queen, or by playing king h1. And why should we have any advantage here? I mean, our pieces are a bit more active. But other than that, we have opposite colored bishops. So if we trade queens, it's a draw right away. White has no weaknesses, we have no weaknesses. Okay, it looks to the eye like a bit of pressure or something, but it's just a visual mirage because it's nothing. And now let's compare. After rook d1, if we take with the bishop, knight d4 and knight d4. What do you think is better, this bishop or this knight? And now also, of course, if we trade the queens, there are no opposite colored bishops, so the endgames are not drawn by any means. Let's just imagine that we put the pawn on b4, the pawn on a5, there are no queens on the board, and we play knight b5, knight c3. It is just winning, with rooks, without rooks. So basically, here it was very important to realize that the knight is actually better than the bishop. And the play for black was very easy here. I was already thinking how I will show this game today. But apparently I was thinking about it a bit too soon. Queen to b6, bishop e4. Okay, I'm just making logical moves. Rook d8, queen b2, and the plan with b4. Yeah? So then I want to bring the knight to c3. And even if we trade all the heavy pieces, just we bring the knight to c3, and the bishop versus knight endgame is easily won for black. So my strategy was very simple, and he made a move which shocked me here. He played f4. I was thinking, how can it be possible? I mean, there were no weaknesses in white's position. Suddenly, there are also weaknesses in white's position. think, great way to finish the game. So I continue my plan, knight b5, take, queen to f2. And I see that white wants to play maybe f5. It still doesn't threaten anything, but okay, at least maybe there will be at some point some threats about my king. And I decided to repeat the position once. I played queen d2, rook e2. Okay, thinking, who knows, maybe my opponent would want to trade queens. It's always good to check. Rook e2, queen d6 back, rook to e1. And here I decided to go for knight c3, as it was my initial plan. And I actually missed a very interesting tactical trick, completely unobvious to me. He played bishop b7. Okay, I didn't understand what was the point of this move, so I just played rook b8 with the idea that, okay, bishop f3 is not possible because the pawn on f4 is hanging. And if bishop e4, I was planning to go rook to e8, and I was very happy about it. Where does this bishop go? I was not sure. Okay, and here after rook b8, the answer came. He played f5. Surprise, surprise. Not a very pleasant one. And now I cannot take the bishop, because after rook e8, king g7, f6 follows. And after queen f6, there is rook g8, and I lose the queen. And if king h6, there is queen h4 mate. Okay, it wasn't a very pleasant thing to miss, but what to do? We have to fight. So I played king g7. Now I want to take the bishop. He played bishop f3. And still my position is much better. I continued with rook b5, bishop g4. And here I made a mistake. Again, unfortunately. So here, after queen to f6, I would just have a winning position because, well, the queen is pinned. And the main threat is not to take on f5. The main threat is to play h5. And only when the bishop goes to take with a piece on f5, just to have a very healthy extra pawn. And white cannot really do much about it. It's just over. But unfortunately, I didn't realize it, and I just played rook e5, thinking that it should be enough. Take, bishop f3. Now, okay, I continued with a5. He played h4. And now I found this plan to go for knight b5, because this square on g3 is weak, and I want to go knight d4, knight f5. And then still I have this idea to trade queens, because I still know that the endgame should be winning. Okay, here, once again, shock followed. He played h5. I look at the position, I don't see what is wrong if I just take the pawn. So I take it. Queen to h4. And that was the final mistake I made. A rather silly mistake, not to protect the pawn. So it was based on some miscalculation, I will show you later. But king g6 or king h6 would have still won the game, because there is no way for white to give a perpetual. I just bring the knight, knight d6, and okay. This king can even come somewhere here if white insists too much on the checks. So after knight d6, everything is protected. We have an extra pawn and a winning position. Unfortunately, I decided that I don't need extra pawns, so I played knight to c3, and he just took it back. My idea was that after knight e4, I have a lot of threats, and I thought that he doesn't have a way to defend against them. So I want to take on h5 first and then check on g3. I want check on g3 anyway. And my calculation was queen g4 check, king h6. Now I want to play knight f6 and win the bishop. I want to play knight g3. I want to play knight f2. Should be winning. Okay, he found the move king g1. And here I also thought that I was winning. But apparently I'm not. I was thinking that I can play knight g3. Okay, the bishop is hanging, but he cannot go away with it, because after bishop f3, I have queen e1. What was it? And knight to f1. and I trade queens, and then I'm winning. That was my point. So king g1 he played, but then I understood that after knight g3, he can play just queen g4, and when I go with the king somewhere, he can take on f7. And there is no mate here. It looks like it should be some mate, but there is no mate. Queen e3, g3. It's unclear here even who will lose this game. So somehow this king looks very weak, but it is not. So I played here out of sorrow f6, queen g4, knight g5. Still I could have maybe played better here, but he defended very well from now on. Bishop g4, knight e4, bishop f5. And now I decided to trade queens, but unfortunately here he has the move bishop d3 and he dominates my knight, so I don't have enough time to get to c3 in time. You see, it's move 52. I played until move 102. I was still trying to have something to be proud of at today's conference, but just by the will it didn't work. So knight e5, bishop c2, king g5. And here somehow my king cannot pass. For example, he played king f2, king f4, and g3. So I don't have a way to come with the king nicely towards here. So I played king g4, bishop d1, king f5, but now he's also in time with his own king. Knight c6, bishop f3. And here I thought that I found some study-like idea. Knight a7, king d4, knight b5, king c4, knight a3. Why not knight c3? Because of a3, and it's draw. Okay, maybe I can even lose if I try too hard. So I put the knight on a3. We repeated the position once, and I went for knight c7. It looks a bit dangerous, but I was hoping that it could be winning. This was my idea, to bring his king to a5 and now to play king c5. And then to return with the knight to c3 and take on a2. This was a nice plan, but unfortunately there is no way here to make progress. I tried very hard. So, for example, king d4, he just stays with the king on a4, king c3, and he stays. So now if we could just put the knight on c5, then it would be winning. But unfortunately, the knight doesn't move this way. And when we go knight d3, we are ready to give check on c5, he just plays king b5. And that's it. I cannot make progress. Knight f2, bishop e6. So this is how we played another 50 moves and agreed for a draw. Yes. So, okay, I hope that you liked this introduction into the Smyslov Ruy-Lopez. I hope it will inspire you to have good games today. Don't relax too soon. Take the pawns when you can. And yeah, let's hope that we will win